This video is sponsored by Rattlecan Studios. Check the links in the video description to get your army painted. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I played in a Warhammer 40k GT, a 5-round event with 80 players where I decided to play a giant, stupid dragon. For those who aren't aware, a Harridan is a giant, super heavy Tyranid monstrosity, and in fact is one of the very few super heavy monsters in the entire game as a whole. Now, I have a Harridan. I'll paint it up. He's right over there. Look at that beautiful guy. Stunning, handsome gentleman. And I decided to take him to the 5-round Captain Con Grand Tournament in order to see how many units I could add to his dragon's horde. Now, let's talk about the list that I took to the event. This actually took about a week worth of testing. I do have a longer video discussing exactly how the list plays in the battlefield and all the explicit tactics that you can use with it. That's available for my YouTube channel members. It's been up there for a little while. But first of all, when you build a Warhammer 40k list, you choose a detachment. In this case, we are playing the Tyranid Detachment Subterranean Assault. This detachment is really cool. It gives your entire army rerolls, which is obviously helpful. On top of that, it also makes it easy to reposition your units around the battlefield through use of a tunnel network. This is a unique mechanic that constructs tunnel markers around the table when you erupt from underground with burrowing units. This includes units like the snaky Tyranid Raveners, as well as big monsters such as Trigons and Molochs. The theme of this detachment is absolutely on point. A big part of Tyranid assault methodology is constructing pathways underneath intervening defenses using these sneaky burrowing units, and essentially making the crust of a planet they are invading into a whole front on the war by itself. And to represent that on the battlefield, we can use the tunnels that are constructed by our burrowers to arrive closer than normal when your units come out of reserve. Normally, when units come out of reserve, whether that's deep striking like teleporting or flying onto the battlefield, or strategic reserving, which means that you have just simply outflanked your opponent to come off a different table edge, you normally have to set up 9 inches away from enemies. However, the tunnel networks available to the subterranean assault allow you to set up 6 inches away as long as you do so near a tunnel marker. This lets you do a bunch of stuff. You can get weird angles on things with your ranged attacks. You can also get easier charges with your melee units. It's very helpful. There's also a bunch of ways that we can reposition units between tunnel markers. We have ways to bring units into reserve to then bring in on the subsequent turn out of a tunnel marker, or you can use the tunnel network stratagem to have a unit enter a tunnel, then arrive on a future tunnel. It's all very cool and thematic. And to further cement the theme, the Harridan, a 30-wound, 20-inch long Titanic aircraft, is not restricted from entering tunnels, which makes perfect sense. Of course, a tiny Ravener would be able to make a hole big enough for a Harridan. It's just physics. That allows us to do a bunch of stuff and get around some of the weaknesses of playing the Harridan, which we'll talk about after sponsor time. Aircraft like the Harridan in Warhammer 40k have a bunch of downsides. They have a minimum movement that they have to move every turn, and they can only do so in straight lines. This makes it really easy to predict where they're going to go on the table. However, Subterranean Assault does a couple different things. First of all, it allows us to enter reserve with the Harridan. So he can fly onto the battlefield, and instead of having to move normally straight forward like he would if he was a normal aircraft, we could use a stratagem to place him back in reserve and then arrive back on the battlefield without having to make his minimum movement. On top of that, we can also allow him to come out of tunnel markers when he arrives from reserve, which means he's not subject to the normal restrictions that strategic reserving units like aircraft are subject to that require them to come in off the edge of the battlefield. He can come in out of a tunnel instead of flying in from the sky. And then once he erupts out of the tunnel, he flies into the sky afterwards. He's very dynamic. There are also some other combinations within Subterranean Assault that are very useful. The first one is obviously the rerolls are very nice for him, but also the stratagem Enfilading Emergence, which gives him ignore cover and statistical equivalent to +1 to hit with some upside. You get extra hits when you roll a 6 to hit with your ranged attacks. So this stratagem is basically going to be banked onto the Harridan every single turn. Now, what is he doing with that effect? He has 2 weapons, and that's it. Just 2. Imperial Knights get carapace weapons and arm weapons and shoulder weapons. He just has 2 guns. However, these guns are very impressive. He has 2 dire biocannons firing d6 plus 6 shots at strength 10 AP3 for 3 damage. That's all to say it is a very powerful tank or Terminator killing machine. He also has the ability to take D3 mortal wounds when he is selected to shoot to give himself +1 to wound, meaning that he can overcome high toughness values or defensive mechanics by just improving his own attacks. When we use Enfilading Emergence on him, he should statistically get just about as many hits as he has shots, and he's wounding nothing in the game on worse than a 4, unless you have some sort of defensive technology that I'm not aware of available. Given that he has 2 of those weapons, he's averaging a total of 19 shots, meaning that against basically every target in the game, he's going to average somewhere around 10 successful wounds that you then have to save against at AP3 ignore cover, meaning that most enemies are saving on 6s or maybe 5s if they are protected by, unless they are protected by invulnerable saves. That is to say that the Harridan is very good at picking a single target on the battlefield and killing it super dead without some very specific pieces of defensive technology or defensive stat lines that we will discuss momentarily. Downside is that makes the Harridan very much a one-trick pony. He's very good at killing a single unit, but if he has to kill 2 or more units, things go really poorly. So part of the experiment today is to decide whether or not a Harridan can actually recoup its incredibly pricey tag of 610 points. Each time he kills a unit over the course of the tournament, we will add that unit to his Dragon's Horde, and we will determine at the end of the tournament if the aggregate total of his horde was equal to or more than his total point cost to field over 5 games of 40k, which will be a whopping 3,050 points, given 5 instances of his incredible 610 point value. Given the fact that aircraft have almost literally no numerical impact on the scenario objective scoring of Warhammer 40k, they are not eligible to control objectives since they come in with an OC characteristic of 0, and most secondary objectives will specify that they are not scoreable by aircraft, meaning that the Harridan's entire capacity to influence the outcome of the game comes from his ability to kill his opponents dead. So if the points value of units that he can surreptitiously add to his collection is lower than the points value to field him, he's probably not worth the effort. Now that said, we also have another 1,390 points worth of models that we have to try to make an army out of, weighed down by the anchor of this enormous ugly dragon. Now part of this is going to be kind of dictated by the Subterranean Assault Detachment. We have to take borrowing units in order to make use of most of the detachment effects. So in that case, we have 2 units of Raveners who can naturally go into reserve and return in order to consistently build new tunnels. From there, we also have a Hive Tyrant who has some important synergies. First of all, he gives you a free stratagem use every round for something within 12 inches of him. A lot of times it's going to be the Harridan, who can either use his free stratagem to go into reserve or to tunnel network around the battlefield, or to use it on Enfilading Emergence to buff his attacks. In some instances, if the stars align, the Harridan is also going to be buffed by his own Onslaught aura, which can provide him lethal hits, which is a slight improvement in damage. From there, we are trying to shore up the downside of the Harridan, which is that about a third of our army does not interact with objectives. So we have to take a bunch of units that are good at scoring objectives. That includes a Lictor and a Neurolictor, units that are hard to shoot at because of Lone Operative, who can stand in the middle of the table and score objectives passively. We also have a Neurogaunt unit, which is just a super cheap unit of 10 guys who can screen out areas of the battlefield or, again, score objectives, as well as a Biovore who can build spore mines in areas of the battlefield to restrict our opponent's movement or to score objectives, as well as a single unit of Gargoyles, who are kind of absolutely crucial. These guys are able to move after shooting, and they can do so after they advance with a strong base movement, or they come out of a tunnel. This allows you to reposition them around the table, stand up next to enemies, and then shoot and move and put their OC characteristic onto an objective to steal it from them. Generally speaking, Gargoyles are good for docking your opponent about 10 10 points on their primary objective score by simply stealing the objectives out from under them. Now, last but certainly not least, we actually do have to interact with our opponent and hit them with swords and stuff sometimes. In order to do that, we have a unit of Gene Stealers. In order to improve their damage, we have a Broodlord in that unit as well. I also have a unit of Tyranid Warriors. These guys have twin-linked weapons, which means they're able to reroll their wound rolls. They can do some pretty serious damage, even against high toughness characteristics because of their higher strength characteristic, but they attack a million times. They get extra accuracy from their Winged Tyranid Prime attachment.
Also, I should note, I took the Winged Tyranid Prime instead of the Melee Tyranid Prime because it wasn't out when I made this list.
On top of that, we also have a Tyrannofax. Now, normally, you would be running a Rupture Cannon on this guy, which allows you to answer high-toughness enemy vehicles. It's a huge D6 plus 6 damage laser cannon of a weapon. However, we didn't do that. We're instead taking an Acid Spray, which is a kind of underpowered torrent weapon. It does do 2 damage at a high AP characteristic, but unlike basically every other torrent in the game, sans of handful, it does not ignore cover, which means most of the time your opponents are going to be saving on pretty reasonable numbers. That said, this does a very specific thing in the army that very little else in the Tyranid roster can do, and that is that it clears out those little utility units without having to dedicate things like Gene Stealers or Tyranid Warriors to actually go fight them, or to dedicate the very valuable Harridan gunshots. This guy is able to reposition around the table using tunnel networks and just get lines of sight to enemies and clear out small units of 5 or 10 models. In addition to that, he's also kind of difficult to kill. He has an ablative armor. It's able to blank incoming damage once per game. He also has a 2+ save, high toughness characteristic. So he can stand on objectives and your opponent can shoot him. And a lot of times he doesn't die, which is very helpful. In a lot of cases, he actually just stuck in melee with things for like the whole game and very slowly acid sprayed them to death. It took a while, but he would win the attrition fight by the end. He was absolutely necessary. I don't think he's the best thing at his job ever, but for the limited Tyranid roster, he's basically the best option that we have. So that is the insane brew that I came up with to try to get value out of this Harridan, and I showed up to the event. Now, the Harridan has a very particular set of enemies that he wants to prey on. He largely, because these weapons are blast and shoot a million times, wants to fire into big brick units, lots of models who are all very high toughness, high wounds characteristic. Terminators and Gravis armored space marines, stuff like that. He also doesn't want to play against enemies with guns because they will shoot him, and his defensive characteristics, despite being a 610-point model, let me say that again, 1/3 of your army is this model. He is toughness 10 with no invulnerable save. One of the worst defensive characteristics for points in the entire game. So he wants to dodge enemies with good ranged attacks, dodge enemies that are playing high defensive characteristic non-infantry bricks, and he wants to dodge enemies playing lots of individual models that he kind of overkills with his individual gunshots. Unfortunately for me, the metagame at the time was absolutely inundated with things like Ultramarines, which tend to play high defensive characteristic vehicles, as well as having some of the most effective ranged attacks ever, and Necrons, which have the same thing. They just have really good guns, and they're really hard to kill. Units like Catan Shards have invulnerable saves, which are protected against the high AP characteristic of the Harridan, and they have damage reduction effects, which makes it hard for the Harridan, which relies on a high volume of little attacks, which can be significantly reduced by effects that reduce the damage of each of those attacks. You want to hit those guys with strong individual attacks rather than mass little attacks. And I was really worried because round 1, I did pair against the Necrons. I played against Mike in the first game, and fortunately for me, he was playing a Canoptic Court build, which was reliant on immortal units backed up by rerolls from the Canoptic Court detachment ability to do absolutely insane damage. Now, he did have Catan Shards, which I am not very good at killing, so I essentially determined never to interact with them. There was also a unit of Wraiths, another unit that is incredibly difficult to kill, that in Canoptic Court can be protected by a lone operative effect, preventing enemies from shooting at it, which also meant that the Harridan probably could never attack it if my opponent positioned correctly. So he had 3 big bricks of enemies that I essentially couldn't kill, so I resolved to simply kill everything else in the army. Fortunately for me, the Harridan is incredibly good at killing large infantry units like Immortals, and over the first couple of turns, sandpapered down a lot of my opponent's smaller units. That forced him to push forward with his Catan Shards and his characters like a Luminor Ceres and Necrosaur Amintar. However, we were able to counterattack with the totality of my army to kill the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon that took all of my Gene Stealers, in addition to all of my Tyranid Warriors, in addition to my Hive Tyrant with their powers combined, eventually killing that guy. However, doing so opened up the rest of the battlefield for my army to profitably engage and end up killing basically everything besides the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer and the Wraith unit. Those two were not enough to prevent me from scoring my objectives, and I was finally able to take that game down 86-53. Over the course of that game, the Harridan added 2 units of 10 Immortals, 2 attached Royal Wardens. Every time he shot at them, by the way, he killed all of the Immortals and the Warden. However, they also had an attached Cryptek who barely survived each time. So we very cleanly killed almost 2 full units, in addition to Illuminor Ceres and Necrosor Amintar, for a total horde of 730 points. Now, I do want to shout out Mike for being an absolute class act throughout the entire game. I brought a bunch of Fireball whiskey to the event because I figured it was only fair to share the fireballs that my massive alien dragon was throwing at my opponents with them as I rolled massive numbers of dice to kill their units. And Mike and I both enjoyed those drinks heavily despite it being 9 a.m. In classic 40k tournament fashion, we were off to a good start. And that brought me to round 2, where I was faced with the dreaded Tyranid mirror match. Now, normally, I would actually probably be happy with the Tyranid mirror match. Tyranids tend to bring a lot of units that are kind of easy to kill, easy for the Harridan to draw line of sight to, and easy for him to knock out. On top of that, we have things like the acid spray Tyrannofex, who can come in and clear out their little utility units like Lictors and Neurolictors very effectively. I was hyped until I actually read my opponent's list and realized it was Crusher Stampede, a very specific brand of Tyranids that plays only high defensive characteristic monsters. Now, normally, Crusher Stampede does have a pretty prodigious problem with damage output. Tyranids' offensive profiles are famously terrible, so while it is very difficult to kill with lots of high toughness and vulnerable save protected units, a lot of times it doesn't relax damage, so it ends up stalling out on your opponent's heavily armored stuff. Unfortunately for me, my most heavily armored unit was an airplane who couldn't interact with objectives, so that was not going to go very well for me, especially given the fact that my opponent's toughness characteristics were very high. Now, to make matters worse, my opponent, Anthony, ended up taking the first turn and essentially just blitzing his entire army into the center of the table, which is what I was really worried about. This essentially forces a choice from me. Either I let him score a ruinous number of points. The mission was also Terraform, which if he was allowed to perform actions on these objectives, he had to advance to get there round 1. So fortunately, didn't quite have the action economy to be able to do so. However, if he was able to complete Terraform actions on all these objectives, he could score so many points, it would be horrific. So I was forced to respond immediately. This would not have been the case if I had gone first. I could have taken the first turn off, maybe tried to threaten some scoring with my Lictors and force my opponent to move forward, then come in when the Harridan arrives. Because it's aircrafted, it must begin the game in reserve, and if I started on the battlefield as a hover mode enemy, it can be charged and killed by things like the Norn emissaries and assimilators, and also immediately just be shot by exocrines and rupture cannons and potentially die. I'm not super into that, so I decided to put it in aircraft mode. That makes it very difficult for me if I go second, because this board state can be, however, I won't have my biggest anti-tank piece. That forced me into an extremely tough situation immediately in round 2, and I was forced to respond incredibly aggressively. I pushed all of my Gene Stealers forward, avoiding the overwatch from my opponent's acid spray Tyrannofex, which was in the center, by hiding them just outside of its weapon range in order to answer one of my opponent's psychophages on this side. Hopefully, I could kill it and reduce my opponent's ability to perform actions and score secondary points. On top of that, I also picked up a ton of my Ravener units. This detachment is able to, at the bottom of the first turn, redeploy up to 4 units elsewhere on the battlefield. This includes 2 Ravener squads who can naturally go up into the air and then come down to construct tunnels. And also, I have a stratagem to put 1 unit in reserve, and I have a stratagem to teleport a unit between 2 tunnels. So on the second turn, once the Raveners come in, they can build tunnels nearby my backline units, as well as tunnels in the middle of the battlefield, and I can teleport units between them. So what I ended up doing was simply going all in. I had a charge with the Gene Stealers into the Psychophage, and I picked up all of my Ravener squads, as well as my Tyranid warriors, placed the Raveners down in this back corner, where I made sure that no enemies could see them, and gave myself a potential charge into this Exocrine right here. The Exocrine's incredibly strong at dealing with my little big heavy infantry units units like these warriors, and so I wanted to kill it immediately. It also, when it shoots something, gives rerolls to the rest of the army when targeting that thing, so it combos well with the Rupture Cannon Tyrannifex because the Tyrannifex then gets more consistency on its big cannon. On top of that, there was also a very particular position that was constructed by the Psychophage over here, and I ended up getting most of what I wanted on the second turn. This included a charge of the Genestealers into the Psychophage, which almost but not quite killed it. I also got a charge with these Tyranid warriors into this Exocrine that almost but not quite killed it. We're sensing a theme here. However, I did get my Hive Tyrant a charge into this Psychophage, and I got it on exactly enough distance to move within 1 inch of the Psychophage, but not within base to base. If you roll a high enough charge to move base to base with your target, you must do so. In this case, that would be a 7. However, if you roll less than that, you are able to go up close to it, but not necessarily move into base contact. What I was able to do here is, because of the position of this wall, was engage the Psychophage and attack it with my Hive Tyrant. Now, the Hive Tyrant has a pretty good weapon profile at killing, especially because I get my Hive Tyrants out to deal damage. I give them 2 sets of melee attacks, a Bone Sword, as well as a set of Scything Talons. They're very good at killing these kind of lighter enemy units. So we ended up killing a Psychophage, and that allowed him, because he was within range of this objective, to actually tuck behind this wall with his consolidation. The way that the board was set up, that would actually protect him from most enemy shooting and most charges, allowing him to very safely control this objective. An absolutely huge pickup for me. However, none of my other units ended up killing their target, which was very sad. Fortunately for me, my opponent's subsequent turn was also not that great. He did fall back with his Exocrine. However, he failed a charge with his Tyrant Guard and his Hive Tyrant units to try to come kill my warriors, and his return fire shooting, because he didn't have the Exocrine there, didn't actually clear the unit. He only killed about 4 of them. That said, my Genestealers got really beat up, leaving, I think, only my Broodlord alive after we saw some shooting from the Emissary, as well as the Acid Spray from the Tyrannifex, and a unit of Pyrovores that had also arrived from reserve to shoot them. However, it ended up leaving me with control of this objective. So my primary score was already starting to go up, and I had a bunch of my opponent's units down to very, very low values. I ended up killing the Psychophage, just like the second Psychophage, to clear off this objective, as well as getting a charge into this Exocrine. Now, the Harridan arrived at the start of round 2, and because he is an aircraft model, is able to use true line of sight rather than the game's normal line of sight rules. This is crazy for this guy, because the Harridan model is absolutely enormous. Now, this works both ways. Enemies are also able to draw true line of sight to him, but that means that if you can look behind the model and physically see any enemies from that position, you can target and shoot them. And this allowed him to fire clear across the board and try to kill his biggest predator, the Rupture Cannon Tyrannifex. And he did so with aplomb, rolling, if I remember correctly, 17 or 18 hits on him, which he then converted into exactly 2 saves that my opponent then saved. I just rolled like 15 1s, 2s, and 3s in a single dice roll. For everyone who says that the online simulator dice are weird and IRL 40K plays more consistently, you're wrong. That's just a fallacy. Warhammer 40K is always really dicey and silly. Unfortunately, that meant that I was hoping to have cleared out my opponent's backline shooting by the time that my Harridan arrived, but I didn't end up doing that. However, I did end up killing his Exocrine. That allowed the Tyrannifex to shoot into the Harridan, but he only ended up converting 1 hit, dealing significant damage, but not necessarily killing it. Now, he also decided to put a lot of pressure on my home objective, my midboard here. He actually moved his Maleceptor around to try to deal with my Tyrannofex that was moving around to consolidate the control of this objective. Now, the Tyrannofex ended up just blasting him several times with acid sprays and very slowly dealing damage to the Maleceptor. Maleceptors do not have particularly strong armor saves, but they do have good invulnerable saves. However, the fact that the AP characteristic of the acid spray is not great isn't that big of a deal against the Maleceptor, because you just try to force saves on them until they fail. And he eventually, over the course of basically the entire game, ended up killing the Maleceptor. The Maleceptor ended up charging into the Tyrannifex, beating him up a little bit. However, the Tyrannifex, between acid sprays versus melee attacks, acid sprays, melee attacks, he eventually killed the Maleceptor and won that fight. What an absolute Chad. Also, over the course of this game, we literally experienced the Shadow in the Warp, which turned off all of the lights in the gaming hall, which is incredibly thematic. Now, the Shadow in the Warp ended up having a pretty particular effect, because my opponent's Acid Spray Tyrannifex, which is trying to wrest control of this this objective, ended up failing a battle shock check. And because of a nearby Neurolictor, I got +1 to wound against it, meaning that a lot of my attacks were actually improved. And due to some good dice rolls, I was eventually able to kill it. That forced my opponent to use a Norn Assimilator coming out of Strategic Reserve to actually wrest control of that objective and ensure that I no longer controlled it. Now, that bullied me off of most of these areas of the battlefield. My Tyranid warriors had been killed at that point, and I was mostly down to utility. However, my Hive Tyrant did a great job of holding down this objective. That gave me at least parity with my opponent on objective control for the most part until the late game. And because I had more action economy than he did, I was able to continuously perform actions with my smaller units like Raveners and Gargoyles and Neurogons. I was able to terraform more objectives than him, driving up my primary score slightly faster. That greater capacity to score primary in the early game, as well as secondaries throughout the game, meant that even though I was losing more models on attrition, and the Harridan wasn't really contributing to the fight whatsoever, I actually took a shot into the Hive Tyrant's unit, hoping he would be able to strip out the Tyrant Guard, which would score me an overwhelming force point, and potentially change some of the primary objective scoring. He actually failed to kill them. He only killed 3 of them, which was dramatically below average. And while he ended up succeeding in killing the Hive Tyrant and his Tyrant Guard, that was literally all he did for the entire game. So he was very useless. However, my Tyranofex, killing my opponent's Maleceptor in the late game, allowed me to score a late game Bring It Down, and my ability to utilize the Raveners to teleport around the table to continuously score points allowed me to eventually win. 93 to 81, both of us scoring enormous numbers of points over the course of the game. This is an incredibly difficult matchup that I did not expect to get out of unscathed, especially given the fact that a lot of my opponent's models were toughness 11 plus, which is exactly what the Harridan doesn't want to shoot at because it's only strength 10, meaning it baseline wins them on 5s, goes down to 4s with its own friendly metabolism, but that is very inconsistent attack characteristics, which was exemplified by the fact that he only ended up killing the Tyrant Guard and the Hive Tyrant over the course of the entire game, a grand total of 355 points and dramatically below his 610 point value. And that put me into what is my most difficult matchup of all time, the third round of the day, which, if I were to analyze my win rates, would probably be my worst win rate of all time, just because I'm tired by the end of the day. In this case, I was up against James, who is playing Death Guard, and an interesting variety of Death Guard, he was playing Mortarian's Hammer. This is a detachment that allows you to cause the affliction effect onto enemies at the start of each battle round as long as they are far enough away from you. The big thing there is that afflicted enemies allow Death Shroud Terminators to teleport nearby them and then charge into them. Death Shroud Terminators have a great offensive profile. They can be very high AP and have a mass 1 damage attack, which is good against enemies with a damage reduction effect. They also get huge bonuses from characters like Attached Lords of Contagion. Now, in this case, James was playing a bunch of bloat drones who could act as his backline shooting, as well as Mephitic Blight Haulers, who have bonuses against monsters and vehicles. And the bloat drones have a good weapon profile at attacking into my Harridan. So I was a little bit worried and resolved to focus fire them down first, so the Harridan had enough time to fly around the battlefield and clear out my opponent's infantry. Now, unfortunately for me, in this game, I ended up taking the first turn, which did give me a little bit of agency over the battle. However, given the fact that my opponent did have a lot of good shooting into me, if I ended up going second, I actually would have been able to bring in the Harridan a turn after his second round of shooting. So if I play cagey, I can basically force his guns to shoot into things that either don't matter or that things that and not be able to shoot entirely by hiding away and make things much easier for myself. That said, there is a little bit of a benefit to going first in this matchup, which is that so they have to select things to be afflicted a turn before the affliction becomes relevant. So but a turn before their Terminators and things get to arrive, which means that I can actually play around their affliction a little bit. Now, my opponent did place a unit of Poxwalkers onto a mid-mort objective in the center here. And here's where I started to get a little bit unlucky. I actually pushed my Tyranofex as far forward as it could go to gain line of sight to these Poxwalkers in order to try to clear some of them off the objective and at least start forcing battle shock checks on them in order to wrest control of that objective. Unfortunately, my Tyranofex on the top of the first turn did literally no damage to them. I think he killed 1, maybe. Between D6 plus 6, 2 damage shots, as well as his little secondary spine bank attack, he did almost literally nothing to the Poxwalkers. And as a bit of a spoiler alert, he actually wouldn't kill enough of them to contest the objective until the third battle round of the game. He basically totally flubbed out on this unit almost entirely, which was brutal. I hoped that I would either kill them or do enough damage that I could charge onto the objective next turn and force my opponent to deal with this Tyrannofex, contesting his expansion objective. However, what the reality was that the Tyrannofex ended up basically not being able to contest this objective for almost the entirety of the game. Now, I also drew Established Locus early in the game, which forced me to move a Lictor into the center of the battlefield in order to score 2 points. Now, that gave my opponent the opportunity to charge him with his Chaos Spawn, get onto this objective, and really put a lot of pressure onto my army because he's doing a lot of screening with this unit. Now, there is a chance that this Lictor survives the attack. That's because the Lictor has fights first and 6 pretty high strength melee attacks. If you are in Synapse range, they end up going to strength 8. So he ends up wounding these guys on 3s. So he has a pretty good chance of killing one of them before they get to attack him back. And if he does that, their chances of killing the Lictor are actually relatively low. Unfortunately, he barely didn't kill either of them, and they were able to one-shot the Lictor in response. That basically cleared out the center of the battlefield for me and forced me to ask myself what I'm going to do about these Chaos Spawn that's standing right here. He doesn't have to take battle shock checks, and he can simply stand there and threaten control of that objective. Now, I elected to charge them with my Gene Stealers, and I felt really bad about this because I was essentially throwing the Gene Stealers into the meat grinder way earlier than I would prefer to. This is kind of what the Tyrannofex is supposed to do. He's supposed to clear out units like this. However, because Death Guard Chaos Spawn are so difficult to kill, they're protected by Feel No Pains and a high toughness characteristic, he's actually really bad at doing that. Normally, he's better against units like Poxwalkers, but not this particular game. So my opponent's utility basically immediately beat the shit out of my utility and threatened a massive lead on primary in the very early game. And that forced me to play way more aggressively than I wanted to. So the Gene Stealers pushed forward to clear out these Chaos Bonds, so my opponent couldn't hold the middle of the table here. My Harridan arrived on turn 2 and ended up very cleanly killing my opponent, my Phytic Blighthaulers. So he didn't have the super long-range anti-tank missile shooting that he would normally have against the Harridan. This is actually a kind of nice profile matchup for the Harridan because he is almost perfectly statted to, on average, kill one Blighthauler with 1 cannon, and he has 2 cannons, so if he's able to do this for the entirety of the game, he could kill all of these little drones 2 models at a time. Now, that said, my opponent responded by bringing in his Terminators. He was able to bring in 1 unit over here in order to try to clear out my Gene Stealers. He also brought a 2nd unit in to try to fight the Tyrannofex, and he brought in Typhus in order to complete an objective. Now, to make matters worse, he also had a unit of Plague Marines that were able to move up into the center of the table here and make a charge into my Gene Stealers. That gave him 2 units that, because of the Affliction effect with the Deshret Terminators, they were able to go to the center, and then also this Plague Marine unit was able to go to the center as well. I believe that turn 2, he brought in all 100% of his Terminators. I think his 3rd unit came in as well, but I believe that also didn't end up charging. It attempted to charge onto my home objective, but it didn't end up making it. Now, here's where a little bit of my tiredness came in. I was really, really worried about my opponent's ability to 6-inch deep strike and get to my home objective. So what I ended up doing is stringing a lot of my infantry and chaining them along the backside of my deployment zone here in order to prevent him from getting charges into my back area. However, what that did is that I had brought my models close enough so that he could get his Plague Spewer shots from his Deshret Terminators into them when they arrived. So the Deshret Terminators teleported onto the objective, just barely got range with a couple shots into the gargoyles, and started to clear them out very quickly, which was a lot of my primary objective control game plan down the drain. Now, because he had made a pretty long charge with the Plague Marines over here, they were in the center of the battlefield in a pretty aggressive position. And I was really hoping that I could fade a charge on my Neurolictor in the corner here in order to try to keep him alive. Now, with all these melee attacks available to them, the Deshret Terminators very quickly picked up the Gene Stealers, unfortunately, but that put these Plague Marines in a scary position. However, in order to complete this charge successfully, they needed to get into a very specific position next to my Neurolictor. The way that the math had eventually ended up working, I believe, is that they needed an 8-inch charge in order to engage the Neurolictor, which they subsequently hit. However, the benefit for me was that put not enough of them, because the charge was basically exactly what they needed, but not enough to get more models up close and personal to actually kill the Neurolictor, and the Neurolictor survived their follow-up attack on the subsequent turn. Now, the Harridan had peeked over in order to kill Typhus to prevent him from completing a secondary action, and we ended up killing another Fetid Blow Drone. However, because we aren't able to pull all of our attacks into the Blow Drones were able to basically just float around and continuously shoot into the Harridan every single turn. He basically ate 2 Blow Drone shots every turn of the game, very slowly sapping his wounds pool. Not to mention the fact that every time he shoots, he does damage to himself, so he was pretty quickly losing out on those wounds by himself. Now, the Tyran effects, unfortunately, eventually went down to the Deshrod Terminator unit over here. He did eventually kill the Poxwalker unit, but that allowed the Deshrod Terminators to threaten control of this objective. Another Deshrod Terminator unit eventually ended up making a charge over here. I think it was a relatively long charge because I had pulled my models back pretty far to try to dodge the 5-inch move plus charge that the Deshrod Terminators had, and they ended up charging in and hitting the charge onto these Raveners. That allowed me to heroically intervene, which essentially allowed me to split the unit into 2 separate combats. My opponent was able to put his Lord of Contagion and 1 Deshrod Terminator into my Raveners, as well as 2 Deshrod Terminators into the Hive Tyrant. Almost in no universe enough damage to kill the Hive Tyrant. And fortunately for me, his attacks were not amazing. He actually didn't end up even killing the Raveners, and he did only a little bit of damage to the Hive Tyrant. And over the course of the next couple of rounds of combat, because these guys lose a lot of damage output when they don't charge, I eventually ended up killing the Terminators and leaving only the Lord of Contagion alive, although he ended up killing my Raveners there, which restricted a lot of my capacity to redeploy my models on the backline. Now, without as many tunnel networks as I would hope to have, because my Raveners over here had been killed, I had a unit of warriors in strategic reserve that I had left there from the beginning of the game. I didn't know what to do with these guys, so I ended up rapid ingressing them into this corner to try to keep them alive from the Fetid Blow Drone unit by the end of round 3. If you don't do that, they end up being destroyed. You have to bring in your strategic reserves in round 3. And this was probably another mistake that I made. I had hoped that I would be able to bring these guys in a useful position where I could counterattack when my opponent came in and attacked me with Deshrod Terminators. Unfortunately for me, he never really gave me an opportunity to engage near any of my tunnel markers. So I rapid ingressed to try to contest this objective, however, ended up drawing Sabotage as a secondary objective on round 4. It's an objective that can score you up to 6 points if you can complete an action inside a terrain feature in your opponent's deployment zone. So that's what we attempted with these guys. My Harridan had also flown over at the start of round 4 into my opponent's deployment zone, where he had a Tallyman holding his home objective and cleared off the Tallyman to prevent him from scoring the home objective. At this point, my Harridan was pretty messed up, though, because of several rounds of shooting from the Fetid Blow Drones. So my Neurolictor ended up engaged by a bunch of Plague Marines. I had hoped that he could battle shock them at the start of my turn in order to retake this objective and score it for myself. The Plague Marines ended up passing the test. However, I did end up having a Shadow in the Warp on my opponent's round 4 in order to try to wrest control of any of these objectives. If he failed this battle shock check, he would end up losing control of this objective. If he failed this battle shock check with these Deshrod Terminators, he would lose control of this objective, and the same goes for this one. The only battle shock check that he failed was this one, which was helpful because it meant that this unit, a move 5 unit, would have to make a massive charge into my warriors that were performing sabotage. I said, this is great. My opponent won't be able to reroll this charge. He will likely fail, and then I'll be able to take that objective by the end of the game. Unfortunately for me, he just made the charge anyway. So my warriors ended up engaged and not able to attack those Deshrod. Now that said, my opponent actually failed to kill the Tyranid Prime of the unit. The Deshrod Terminators were not showing up today and did not actually wipe the whole squad. Part of the reason for that being that my opponent had taken -1 to hit as his contagion rather than -1 to save characteristics, which would have put their AP to the point where I wouldn't get a save. In that case, I was able to roll some 6s and leave my Prime alive, which completed the action, scoring me a boatload of points. However, the fact that basically all of these charges had been made, I think my opponent failed like a single charge over the course of the entire game, and the fact that these Plague Marines refused to battle shock meant that I wasn't able to score much primary. That put us into round 5 at a pretty tight score. However, my Harridan was bracketed and ended up not really being able to do very much. I think he fired his cannons into one blow drone and failed to kill it, if I remember correctly. Then, being so low, simply was killed by the blow drones in response. The first time the Harridan has fallen over the course of the fight. At that point, though, my opponent was able to leave the center objective because he had basically maintained control of the side objectives and actually hit a charge with his Deshrod Terminators onto this objective objective as well. I had put a Ravener unit in here to try to clear out the Plague Marines, left only their Lord of Pox's character alive, and then subsequently lost that unit to the Lord of Contagion, giving my opponent very clean control of this objective. Because I was the first player and my opponent had bottom of round 5, he was able to score a bunch of points at the end there. So, given the fact that I had not made many charges into a lot of these side objectives, and my opponent made a lot of battle shock checks in order to maintain control of those objectives once he had made his way onto them, he was able to take it down at the end of round 5 by running out his bloat drones to maintain control of all of these points. That ended up putting the score at a relatively close 77 to 63. There were definitely a couple instances where some better dice on my part, failed charges of my opponents, and maybe a couple battle shock checks would have rested the score back in. But I think the big downside for me here is that I just floundered my utility units, my gargoyles, and my Neurogons, which are supposed to run onto objectives and grab them from my opponent. I threw away very quickly. Same thing with the Gene Stealers, although I'm not really sure what I'm meant to kill the Gene Stealers with in this particular matchup. It's just a weird profile matchup, which sometimes happens in 40k, where on average, very little from your army kills a particular enemy unit unless you dramatically overcommit, which is what I had to do to prevent my opponent from getting a lead early. I definitely think this was a winnable game. I think there were probably some strategic errors that I made in addition to getting a little unlucky. James ended up going all the way to the finals, by the way. He ended up losing to Knights in the finals, I believe, but almost made it all the way to the end of the event.
I forgot to record a section for this, but Harridan did end up destroying 2 of my fitting Blight Haulers, 1 Bloat Drone, Typhus, and a Tallyman over the course of this game, for a total addition of 470 points to his Dragon's Horde. Not a good showing.
So that moves us on to day 2 of the event, where I was up against Lee, who was playing a Black Templars Bastion Task Force. Now, this is a detachment that gives you huge bonuses to your battle line units, things like Assault Intercessors, and in the case of Black Templars, Crusade Squads, which is a detachment that I actually think is super rad. Most of the time, though, I don't enjoy playing against it because it has good shooting from units like Repulsor Executioners, as well as incredibly strong and fast melee buffed by the Bastion Task Force detachment ability. However, in my past games against Bastion Task Force, I have not had one Harridan, who absolutely flips this matchup on his head. And honestly, I have to apologize to Lee for getting just the worst matchup possible. In this case, he was running a couple of Castle and Marshal units alongside Sword Brethren squads. Importantly, relatively sizable 3-wound infantry squads for me to shoot with my 3-damage blast weapons. That seems pretty good. He also has Repulsor Executioners, a bunch of Crusader and Assault Intercessor squads with attached characters. All pretty good things. Now, we started with myself going first and being able to consolidate a hold on a couple of objectives in the midboard. The mission was Hidden Supplies, so it ended up playing with 4 objectives and very neatly placed one behind a terrain feature that I could hide a lot of my scoring units behind, which was very helpful. So I didn't have to run into the waiting teeth of Repulsor Executioners. That let me post up kind of safely, and in round 2, the Harridan arrived and began his reign of absolute terror, immediately one-shotting a Repulsor Executioner and forcing its models to pile out. Feeling the attrition pressure of a massive dragon breathing fire on him every turn, Lee ended up pushing forward and trying to wrest control of my objectives. He ended up setting up a couple of charges onto my expansion objective, made one of them, and unfortunately I was able to pull out of range of his subsequent charges using a heroic intervention, clear out his units trying to contest me, and then consolidate back onto the objective. So I maintained my objective control, continued to score passively, and the Harridan began just churning through my opponent's utility units, killing units like Infiltrators, Intercessors, and his Sword Brethren squads over the course of several rounds. And with only one remaining Repulsor Executioner, he only had one laser cannon to shoot at the Harridan, which can't one-shot it. It's going to take at minimum 2, but most likely 3 or 4 shots from a single repulsor to actually take him down because he has so many wounds, which meant that the Harridan could fly around almost entirely invincible. Another thing about the Black Templar Repulsor Executioners is that in order to get full effectiveness, they have to fire at a target that is close to a friendly unit. They basically get spotted for by other Black Templars units. However, because the Harridan is an aircraft and can teleport around the table by jumping into holes in the ground, he's able to stay as far away as possible from the vast majority of my opponent's army. That means that he could never get a model within 12 inches to get the interception strike effect from his Repulsor Executioners, and they were just rolling their natural ballistic scale with no dice fixing, which meant that usually the laser cannon would miss or fail to wound with at least 1 attack. Unfortunately for my opponent, this ended up being a fairly one-sided matchup. I was able to take the win down 91 to 62 and added a massive glut of Space Marines to the Dragon's Horde. Harridan took down a Repulsor Executioner, 9 total Sword Brethren in a unit of 5 and a unit of 4, plus all of their attached characters, Castellans and Marshals, marshals, 5 intercessors, and 5 infiltrators. Basically split firing every single turn to fully kill 2 separate Space Marine squads. Absolutely insane amounts of damage for a grand total of 935 destroyed points. Literally almost half of my opponent's army from the Harridan alone. And that put us on to the 5th round of the event, where I was up against Michael and his Imperial Knights. This is another matchup, just like the Crusher Stampede earlier, that I was absolutely terrified of. My opponent had high toughness, high OC models that I had a difficult time scoring against. I had a difficult time killing, even with the Harridan's guns. He could not contend with a Knight, and my opponent had a Knight Castellan, able to deal an incredible amount of incredibly long-range damage with its Volcano Lance. On top of that, he was also playing the Valor Strike Lance, which allowed him to push forward very aggressively with assault weapons. That extends the range of his Castellan and his other big heavy anti-tank weapons, meaning that I likely would only get 1 or 2 activations out of the Harridan before he was eventually laser cannoned to death. Now, this being a very similar matchup to my round 2 matchup against Crusher Stampede, I was very cognizant of how important the roll to go first was. If my opponent went first with his very fast army and high OC, high defensive stat lines, he would be able to simply put armigers on all the center objectives and basically force me to either come forward or lose immediately on primary. And I absolutely, in this matchup, cannot afford to place the Harridan on the table, because if it goes into hover mode and my opponent goes first, he can simply laser cannon it from his deployment zone. Imperial Knights have the ability to move through terrain features as long as they can clear them, with a small chance that they become battle shocked, not the end of the world. And towering units, as long as they touch a terrain feature, use true line of sight instead of the normal ruin blocking line of sight when drawing line of sight through it. Because of the sheer size of the Harridan, there's essentially no place on a battlefield, unless your deployment zone is incredibly well defended, where it can hide on the first battle round. It's almost always going to be in line of sight. So it's in reserve, and I roll to go first, and I win the roll. Being able to take the first turn on this matchup is so big, because I'm able to move my army up and fully commit into my opponent in round 2 with the Harridan on the table. So I end up just basically taking a turn off on round 1. I set up to start building a lot of my tunnels, and I try to hold this objective out on the side here. Now, my opponent does have an armiger that is almost in range to get onto the objective, but not quite in range to do so. He did not roll a high enough advance to move him over. However, he can shoot my Neurolictor, but Neurolictors are pretty tough to kill. They have a -1 to hit effect and an invulnerable save. And the Meltaguns from an Armiger Warglaive did not actually end up going through and killing him. It left him alive, and it left him in a position to hold this objective, which meant I could begin scoring from very early. However, my opponent did end up moving a lot of his knights into aggressive positions, in positions where he could try to threaten control of these objectives. He ended up moving a bunch of his knights here, flanking around the side, but keeping his Knight Castellan safe in case I had any designs on clearing him out or getting into his backline. So that brought us into battle round 2. And unlike my round 2 game, this time, because I was first, I was able to bring the full might of my army down on my opponent with the Harridan in play, rather than piecemealing into what my opponent had. Now, he had placed his models all up on these objectives in order to threaten to score them. However, that opened a very small gap in his lines in this area that I was able to exploit by constructing a tunnel and placing a Tyranid warrior unit somewhere out here where I could get a charge onto his Knight Paladin in that area. Now, the Armiger defensive profile is very similar to that of the bloat drones we discussed earlier. They actually have a little bit more, they have a few more wounds, but that is about it. So we are right around the same defensive stat line that a Harridan can cleanly one-shot with his gun. So when the Harridan arrived, I made sure he had line of sight to both his Knight Paladin as well as this Armiger Warglaive over here. And that allowed him to, with one gun, kill the Armiger Warglaive and tune up the Paladin. Now, the Paladin does have good defensive stat lines against Harridan's attacks. He's high toughness, and he has access in this detachment to rotate ion shields, which can give him a 4+ invulnerable save, so he shrugs about 50% of incoming damage. He still took about 9 damage from the Harridan's shots, which I was relatively happy with. In addition, between all of my pickups, between Raveners, who I was able to build a tunnel with in the middle of the table over here, as well as my warriors, using the uppy downy strat to go into reserve, I was able to build another tunnel network from a second Ravener squad over here, and then use an actual tunnel network stratagem to bring my Hive Tyrant in off of the tunnels constructed by the Raveners. He was able to move into the center tunnel here and then teleport to the second tunnel constructed by the second Ravener squad to this area to give him a charge onto one of the Armiger Helvrins. The Broodlord was already on the battlefield, so kind of like my second game, sort of a retread of the first one, they were able to move up and get a charge onto this Armiger Warglaive. So the idea was that if I was lucky enough, I could pin down the Knight Paladin and clear all of the Armigers that could threaten my expansion objective. And that would pull enough focus away from the Harridan that my opponent would have to kill all my little units here first, lest they score against him. Or he wouldn't be able to get to my expansion objective. I could use my other infantry units to contest his objectives over the course of the game and try to get a primary objective lead. That was the game plan, to try to get around what is otherwise a very difficult matchup. However, I did get kind of lucky. I made all these charges. So we made charges with the Broodlord's unit, with the Genestealers, with the Hive Tyrant into the Armiger Helvrin over here, as well as, importantly, with the Tyranid Prime into this Knight Paladin. Now, I didn't end up killing most of these. I actually got a charge with these Raveners as well. They made their charge out of a tunnel into this Armiger, and I even charged him with the Lictor just to try to get him. Unfortunately, I didn't really do much damage to this guy. He ended up killing a bunch of Raveners. I did bring both of these Armigers low, but not quite destroyed, and importantly, I killed the Knight Paladin. Now, he had taken a brick of damage from the Harridan gunshot already, as I mentioned before. However, I kept telling my opponent, it was kind of a running joke throughout the entirety of the game, that he shouldn't be worried about the damage output of this Tyranid Prime. He doesn't do that much damage. He doesn't have Twin Linked. He has no weapon keywords at all, in fact, which is pretty wild. He does have sustained hits, and he does come in at 2 damage, which is nice. With that 2 damage weapon, he was able to roll a bunch of sustained hits, hitting on 2s and rerolling 1s with the detachment ability, and then convert that into a bunch of 5s to wound, against which my opponent didn't save very well and took something like 8 damage from the Tyranid Prime alone. Absolutely incredible spike of damage that allowed the rest of the Tyranid warriors, with all of their attacks, to kill the Paladin. That, because of the position I was able to get into with my charge, allowed them to engage all of these Armigers, which was actually pretty wild. So my opponent was really gummed up with this warrior squad, which had just made an enormous charge. Now, the Armiger Warglaives, very much like my previous game, defensive profile that is very, very close to being, on average, one shot by one of the Harridan's guns, which meant that in addition to chunking damage off the Paladin, he was also able to kill the Warglaive on my opponent's expansion objective and prevent him from scoring it. So he didn't get a head-on primary, and that forced the Knight Warden forward in order to take that objective. In addition, the Knight Castellan also came forward, and while I had the Harridan as far back away from the Castellan as I could to get him out of range of the plasma cannon that the Castellan had, he was still in range of the Volcano Lance and took a ruinous amount of damage, something like 17 damage, bringing him down below half strength immediately. The Harridan actually ended up spending most of this game battle shocked, so he wasn't able to use any of my cool stratagems, which was very unfortunate. He did end up flying around on a subsequent turn and basically making a glorious push and killing one Armiger before eventually being killed by the Castellan in one shot. That said, however, we were able to put enough damage into the Armiger Warglaive in the center to eventually kill him between the Tyrannofex and some random other Raveners and things attacking him. The Warriors took some shots from the Armigers they were engaged with, lost a couple models, but actually ended up being able to kill a second Armiger by dealing a lot of damage with their silly 2 damage Tyranid Prime. This guy went insane this game. It was crazy. We also were able to kill this Armiger with the Hive Tyrant and eventually kill the Warglaive with the Genestealers as well, leaving the Genestealer unit relatively unmolested. They are very difficult for Armiger Warglaives to kill in melee, so they ended up basically living. That gave me an incredible board state. My opponent had lost one of his big knights as well as basically all of his Armigers. He was left with only a single Helvrin that was hanging out with his Knight Castellan. Now, because the Castellan had moved forward in order to attack the Harridan, he opened up a little bit of a spot back here. Now, one thing that the Gargoyles are able to do is that they have deep strikes. They're able to come in anywhere on the battlefield 9 inches away from enemies when they arrive from reserve. So we can use the stratagem to place them into reserve, then put them 9 inches away from the Knight Castellan with line of sight to it so that they can make a ranged attack. All they have to do is make a single ranged attack, and then that lets them move 6 inches. So if they're able to set up in this position, and my opponent, being Imperial Knights, doesn't have a lot of screening units, that meant that the Gargoyles were actually able to take his home objective, and without any additional attacks involved here, he wasn't actually able to kill all of them immediately. He was able to kill most of them in one shot, with the Siegebreaker cannons off of the Night Castellan. However, he wasn't able to wipe the unit, and they contested his home objective for 2 turns, keeping his primary objective score incredibly low. Now, he was eventually able to clear out those gargoyles, and basically most of the remainder of my army. My Tyrannofex went down to another Volcano Lance shot from the Night Castellan, and his Armiger moved up to control the middle of the battlefield towards the end. I did have my Gene Stealers, and I still retained my tunnel network markers here, so when we came to the end of the game, I actually ended up taking back the center of the battlefield with a 6-inch deep strike in order to grab an area denial that I needed to score. His models were not within 3 inches of the middle, so I was able to get that, and I actually ended up using my Hive Tyrant to strategic reserve himself and place into my opponent's deployment zone to score area denial. It was another situation where towards the end of the game, I was low on attrition with most of my army being destroyed and my opponent still with 2 super heavy knights remaining. However, because I was so maneuverable and able to get around the battlefield with lots of these high OC scoring units, I was able to keep his primary score down and give myself an 88-60 victory. That added exactly one Armiger to my Dragon's Horde at a value of 140 points. Not very good for a 610-point model, honestly, but he did end up killing the Knight Paladin because he did a little bit of extra damage to it, so the warriors were able to kill it. That was kind of big. However, he didn't end up taking it down himself. But that ended up putting me and my big silly dragon at 4-1 at the end of the event, and while my tiebreakers weren't phenomenal, I did end up scoring 11th place out of 70 total players. The event had started with 80, but there was inclement weather, which had caused a couple players to drop. Definitely happy with an X-1 result with a silly Harridan list. The Harridan definitely skews a lot of matchups in one way or another. If you do have good targets for its weapon profiles, it's going to eviscerate you. And if also you get a matchup or a terrain layout where the rest of your army can hide fairly safely, you can kind of just play a passive scenario farming game with Tyranid's characteristic ability to score massive numbers of points. Tyranid's big weakness is their damage output, and the Harridan, in the matchups where he's useful, shores up that weakness almost single-handedly. In some cases, able to kill almost half of my opponent's army. But the downside of this big dragon is that inconsistency. And that becomes very apparent if we look at our Dragon's Horde. In the matchups where he did not have good profile matchups, he did significantly less than his points value in terms of damage. 355 points against Tyranids and 140 points of damage against Imperial Knights. Not enough to justify a points cost of 610. However, in the matchups where he was very good, he was extremely good. Overall, does that mean that the Harridan is worth it? Probably not. He's definitely very expensive for what you get and makes your army incredibly inconsistent. If I hit several matchups over the course of the weekend where my opponent was able to quickly remove a toughness 10, 3+ save defensive profile, I think my win record would not have been quite as good. But it was still fun to play a Harridan and to really rack my brain with how to play against some of these incredibly difficult matchups while playing what is essentially 600 points down in some cases. Definitely a cool unit, and I could see competitive viability for it if it was less expensive. If it was only 450 or 500 points of your army and the rest of your army could focus on scoring and dealing with the defensive profiles that the Harridan's not good into, I actually think that this build is incredibly viable. But those are all my games playing the Harridan. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks to all my supporters, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members. You can join in the link down below the video if you want to get access to exclusive content, as well as Twitch subscribers who can help me keep my live streams going. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming. Yeah, I know.